Welcome to Look, Think, Click. I'm Kevin LJ, and I'd like to talk to you today about being a good friend with your camera and why it's important to really know your camera well. I don't actually like buying new gear. It's strange for a photographer. You'd kind of think most photographers love to get some new piece of equipment. Well, I do, but it's kind of different. What I really mean is that I like having a camera that I know well. This one I've had for just about 5 years now, and I love it. It's a fantastic camera. It's actually the best camera I've ever owned. Nikon D800, great solid workhorse of a camera. The biggest thing about it is that I've gotten to know it well. I've gotten to know how to use it, and I'm really familiar with it. So when I pick it up, when I put it in my hand, it fits, it's easy, it's part of me. And it's really important to get to know your camera well so that when you do go out and use it, you're not kind of fumbling around with the controls and wondering what to do or how to get the type of look and feel for a photograph that you want. If you've sat down with your camera, if you've gotten to know it well, if you've gotten to understand it and know what the different buttons and dials do, what the different menu functions do, and how to control it, then you're going to be able to use it a lot more comfortably and a lot more quickly too, if you need to. So it's really cool to sit down and just spend time with your camera and take a good look at it. And really, they're pretty much all the same, basically, give or take. You know, my first camera, this wonderful old Nikon FTN that I bought when I was 19 years old, and the camera at that stage was already 18 years old. It was a good second-hand camera. It's a lot more simple. It doesn't have a whole lot going on, and so this was also a great way to learn because it allowed me to focus on the actual controls for the exposure and getting focus and things like that. So of course back in those days it was all manual focus, but also there was no automatic setting. There was no option for auto anything. In the viewfinder there is a small needle, and if that needle was up it meant I was overexposed. If it was down I was underexposed. If it's in the middle, that's the correct exposure. That's all I had to go by. So that's what we worked with. Changing the aperture settings was in those days on the actual lens, and then changing your shutter speed, which is it's a great little piece of design on this camera. The control for the shutter speed was down here, so you could do shutter speed and aperture both with your left hand. And so therefore it just allowed me to really concentrate on those two aspects. Of course, back in the days of film, there was no option to change your ISO between frames or anything like that. It was just whenever you changed your roll of film. So I concentrated on understanding what my aperture did, what my shutter speed did, and how to get well-focused pictures where I wanted them. Especially with a lens like this, it's a 50mm f1.4 lens, so the aperture opens up very wide and you can get a nice shallow depth of field, so it was really critical, particularly working in low light situations. I like to use that f1.4 aperture a lot, and it's critical to get your focus right. So just practicing and getting to know the real basic controls of the camera helped me understand photography a lot. And you know, like I said, it hasn't really changed between this camera, between this camera, between the modern cameras, and even to a certain extent your phone cam. They do function a little bit differently, but they basically have the same controls for exposure. My great-great-grandfather, one of my great-great-grandfathers, Frederick Cooper, was a photographer in New Zealand, in the South Island of New Zealand. He worked with a large format wooden box camera that took 8 by 10 inch glass plates for the negatives. These days we've got a sensor in the camera. Back then he was using glass plates that was sensitized with an emulsion. His camera functioned basically the same way that our modern cameras do. It's got a shutter speed, it's got an aperture, those things control the light, and it's capturing an image in those days on a glass sensitized plate, and these days with an electronic sensor, of course. But essentially the functionality of the camera to capture an image, to control the light so that the right amount of light was hitting the sensor, or the glass plate, is the same as it is today. So if you can learn how to do those simple things, you're still going to be able to make great pictures. My great-grandfather, Frederick Cooper, had a disadvantage in that his camera did not have an exposure meter, which our cameras all have. So whether it's on an automatic or a manual setting, your camera is able to help you to determine the exposure. So he had to guess his, and I've got some great quotes from him about how he did that and how it was more important to do it by intuition than anything else. And I love that. I'm really inspired by that. He would have had to have known his camera well. He would have had to have known more than just the camera. He would have had to have a real feeling for the light, because he was gauging it all manually, like not even having a shutter speed timer. It would have just been however long he had his thumb, probably on a small cable release, and on and off, exposed, finished exposure. Simple as that. We need to know how to set those settings on our camera, our shutter speed, our aperture, our ISO, so that we can get a well-exposed image. We need to do things like learn to use the exposure meter if we're in manual mode, so that we know what is going to be well exposed and what's not going to be well exposed. And so if you learn these basic functions, if you learn these simple things, you'll get more familiar with the camera, and you'll be able to control the camera more easily and more quickly, and then photography will be a lot more enjoyable. Even if you're just using your phone, if you're just working with apps on your phone, there's lots of really cool apps now. A lot of phone cams have built-in manual control, because the manufacturers are realizing that there's people that do enjoy to have some control over the exposure. Same again, if you get used to using those apps and how they are controlled, then it will become a lot more enjoyable and a lot easier and a lot quicker to take photographs in manual mode. And I've got a new phone relatively recently, and the configuration of the camera setup is different, and it's like, yeah, I've got to get used to this. I've got to sit down and study it. So, if you've got time, or make time to sit down just with your camera, not when you're going out taking photographs. If you can sit down and just relax and enjoy your camera, say if you're traveling, if you're on a plane or a bus somewhere or a boat, sit down with your camera and just look it over and become familiar with the controls and get curious about it. If you've got an internet hookup at the same time, Google it or use YouTube. These two ways of learning your camera are much easier to understand typically than trying to read the manual that came with the camera. Those things are notoriously difficult to understand and kind of boring. So if you've got a fairly popular camera, there's certain to be people that have got wonderful videos right here on YouTube, and then also Google, where there's review sites where there's individuals that have written about them. There's lots of ways to learn about the different functions of your camera. But be encouraged to learn the most simple ones, the most basic, the most essential functions first, and then get deeper into the more intricate settings, if you like. And if you're using your camera always on an auto mode, then that's cool. You've got to understand, though, what all of the different auto modes do, and there's a myriad of them on some of the new cameras. It's incredible how many different little modes that they can squeeze in for portraiture and sports and landscape and night photography and whatever there's a mode for. They've thought of it and included it on a lot of these cameras. And so it's not just about doing everything manually. If you choose to shoot in auto, then you've got to know what these auto modes are doing and how they function so you can choose the right one. But you'll always hear me encourage you to learn manual first. If you learn to use the manual mode on your camera, you can forget about all those confusing auto modes and just do it manually. It takes practice, but that's what it's all about. Get to know your camera, get to appreciate your camera and know how it functions and know what the buttons and dials do and how to make it work for yourself. And you'll be a lot more comfortable using it than if every time you go and pick it up and you're wondering, oh, how did I change that shutter speed last time, or what did I do to set that focus mode the way I liked it? If you practice and if you study, it will become a lot more enjoyable for you as you get to know your camera, as you get to make friends with your camera. Okay, that's all for today from Look, Think, Click. Please do subscribe to our YouTube channel. We've got lots of good videos up there already, and there's more coming.